Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lemorack, and welcome to my channel. Today, I would like to be doing something a little bit different from normal. We're not going to be doing a narrated gameplay video today. Instead, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about a personal project that I had been working on. As you can tell from the title, it involves education, it involves teaching kids about space travel, and it involves video games, a very specific video game, in fact. The one that you are watching footage of right now, it's called Kerbal Space Program. And I used this video game this semester to try and teach a bunch of kids about space travel. So, let me just start at the beginning. I have just recently, last week, finished my 3-year training in pedagogy, or educational theory, in all of its other names. And as part of that training, there were several things that I had to do. Interestingly, almost all of them, I kind of found a way to do it using video games, which is super cool. I needed to write a thesis, obviously, university education. I needed to get some vocational practice, also, obviously. And I also needed to do some volunteer work. The latter of which is the one that I'd like to be talking about. My thesis was about teaching college students about specific topics using Civilization as an educational tool. Civilization 4, specifically, if you're interested. My vocational practice I spent at a gaming research center that was conducting a study trying to link workplace motivation with gaming, the gamer types, right? Various gamer types using different models. And then there's this little project of mine that I myself worked on. The reason I'm super proud of this one, out of all the others, I'm proud of all of them, but the reason I'm very proud of this one is because, unlike the other ones that were existing projects that I happened to get wind of and joined in on, this is a project that was entirely up to me. This is one that I initiated. It was my brainchild. It was my idea, and it was my initiative that got it going, and it was my perseverance that led it all the way to its conclusion. And I'm super happy about it. If you want to read about this, and you'd rather not listen to me ramble about it, I have a website called lemorack.com where I feature all my artwork and occasional blog posts. My videos, links to my videos can also be found up there. And my very most recent blog post is one called "The Story of How I Taught Kids About Space Travel Using a Video Game." And that basically has the whole thing much better structured, all scripted and written down there. If you want to take a look at it, there's a link in the description for you to check out. I'll link you to the, in case you're watching this much later, then I will link the actual blog post and not just the website, so you can find it more easy. If you'd rather listen to me talk about it, well, here I go. Basically, let me start at the beginning. How did I get this idea? What was my thought process leading up to this? Multiple times I have stated in the various videos I made about Kerbal Space Program that if I had the opportunity to play Kerbal Space Program back when I was a kid, or back before I started high school, or even during high school, if Kerbal Space Program had existed like before 2011, then I very likely wouldn't be in the field that I am in today. I know this is a very bold thing to say, but I probably would be in an aerospace engineering career, or at least in training, by now, if I had gotten my hands on this. And the reason for this is just that ever since I've played Kerbal Space Program, all the way, first back in 2014, I have been transformed into a space nut. And I almost entirely blame this video game for it. I had obviously been fascinated by space travel prior to this, but I haven't actually had a good grasp on the concept and understanding of it before I started playing this game. For those of you who maybe don't know what Kerbal Space Program is, let me start there actually. Kerbal Space Program is a spacecraft construction and spaceflight simulation video game with minor business management elements to it as well, if you want to play in kind of a career mode. The game offers that as well. I don't really think it's too in-depth, but the actual core of the game, the real good part of it, is the physics, the true to physics, true to life physical, albeit somewhat downscaled solar system that operates based on real life physics, and the spacecraft flying in this world, in this miniature solar system. This is also the video game, by the way, that you are currently watching footage from, in case you're unfamiliar with it. So, it was announced to me during the spring semester this year that I would need to do some sort of volunteer work in order to get my diploma in the end. And this volunteer work, it had to be education related. Again, since I'm in the education theory program and not teacher's training, which at least in this country, maybe elsewhere too, are two separate things. I can't teach with my degree. This meant that I didn't actually have to go, teach a class, help a teacher with their class, right? This meant that I had to do some sort of education-related activity. Didn't even have to be in a school. Like, it could be a charity organization, something that had to do with children, juvenile facility, orphanage, anything like that, right? Where volunteer work is accepted. And again, coming off of that idea that I was talking about earlier, how I think that this game would have launched me in the direction of an aerospace engineering, or heck, maybe even an astronaut career, I came to thinking that I wonder how many other kids can be in a similar situation to me, to mine, where they might be super interested in spaceflight, but they've just never seen it presented to them in a very interesting way, or heck, maybe they weren't even exposed to it at all. And that's what school is supposed to be about, right? School is supposed to, at a young age at least, provide a wide range of activities and fields to interact with, so that the students can properly, determine which one it is where, which one it is they feel a connection to, where they feel like they could be, they could make their own futures in. And I thought back to my school years. I had never been exposed to space flight or space exploration as part of my school education, right? Every once in, I think there was one time when I was in preschool in the United States where we visited a library, and the librarian read us a picture book about the Apollo moon landing, right? So, that was pretty cool. But come on, I was a preschool kid. I didn't really get any of that. And this was basically the thought that launched me along this path. What if I took Kerbal Space Program? What if I took spaceflight? Kerbal Space Program was an afterthought a bit later. What if I took spaceflight into a school where you don't usually find it, and see if I can get a bunch of kids in like an extracurricular activity where we all just explore space from the classroom? It was a single leap from there on that then said to me, and why don't you use Kerbal Space Program? Hey, this is what got you into it, right? I was like, yeah, me, you're right. This is what got me into it. That's the entire point of simulations, right? Is to provide a hands-on experience in a field where you couldn't do that otherwise. This is what they did with the actual Apollo missions. Before there was a moon landing astronauts, the commanders and lunar module pilots would train in simulators because they needed the hands-on experience. You can't just give them the theory, say you do this and you do this in these particular situations. No, they have to practice it. And this video game, this is one way to do that. This is the reason that by this point, by the way, my other video game related projects had been in full swing for a while. So I'd always been advocating video games as educational tools just specifically because of this, that they provide practical experiences in fields where it wouldn't necessarily be possible. You can't organize a class trip to space. You can't do that. You can have kids play space simulation video games, though. You can do that. So in a class about space, why not give it a try? And so that's what I did. That's what I decided to do. I came up with a concept that would involve extracurricular activities with 8th grade students so that they would already have some kind of basic concept of physics that they didn't get from me. In Hungary, 7th grade is when you learn physics. And I then started thinking up this idea, this concept, and I started fleshing it out. Let's start with that. Here's the concept of the extracurricular course that I decided to try and take into a school to use to teach kids about spaceflight. Basically, what I wanted to do was take all these students who would, preferably volunteer, and organize them into their own little miniature space program. Students would be separated into 3 groups. There would be a group of scientists, there would be a group of engineers, and there would be a group of astronauts. All of these groups, I think, in ideal cases, would be either 2 to 3 members, which means that the entire course would be like a minimum of 6 students, 9 maybe as kind of like an optimal number, and maybe like 10, 11, 12 maximum. These groups would all have different functions, right, in this virtual simulated space program of ours. The actual space flying would take place in the video game as well as the spaceplane construction, but the course itself would, of course, be a bunch of other elements wrapped around the video game. This will become more clear as I describe the functions of the various groups. Start with the scientists. Scientists would be sort of the administrative branch of the space program. Probably the least boring because this is the one that doesn't actually use the video game, right? So this is probably the ones that the students would be the least enthusiastic about. They would be the ones who are basically the ones who determine mission parameters. I would give the group the goal of, before the school year ends, I want you to land on the moon. And then the scientists would be responsible for figuring out what individual missions lead up to a moon landing. They would determine what types of vessels would be needed for these missions. They would hand these mission plans over to the engineers, and then they would also, give them the seal of approval if the constructed spacecraft and meets specifications. That's basically what the scientists would be doing. Engineers would be the ones building the spacecraft. Obviously, they would get their orders from the scientists, and then they would build the spacecraft to specifications, modify it if need be, based on feedback from the scientists, or the pilots, the 3rd group, or astronauts, who fly the missions. That's probably the simplest role. Before any of this, of course, occurs, I would probably spend maybe like the first 1 or 2 sessions just doing a more traditional, presentation style, lecture style sessions on the history of space travel, the current space travel, space flight activities, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, NASA, China, Russia, and the like. Then I would probably, even bring some movies, things that I think might have some value for them to learn from, some documentaries. And then I would spend maybe an entire other session just with the game. Just me, showing them what the game's elements are. And once all that's done, once they have a basic knowledge of various things, all of the things that they need to get started, then it would basically organize them into these 3 groups. Again, preferably on a volunteer basis, but I would obviously sort of intervene if too many people wanted to flock to one unit, as I kind of assumed people would toward the astronaut. Like, my initial assumption was that everybody would want to be an astronaut. And then I would kind of just, let them free. I would say, okay, so these are your groups. Here are your tools. Here are the rules. A little bit more on that in a while. And just, all I want from you guys is for you to accomplish this goal of landing on the moon before the school year ends. I also considered adding some minor business management elements to the game. Like if I felt like it felt particularly confident, if the students felt particularly confident, then the scientists would also kind of have to balance a budget. They would have to, I would give them a total space program budget with possible opportunities for them to gain additional funding through, I don't know, maybe like pitches that they make to a virtual group of investors or something like that. I'm trying to make the whole process really gamey, right? That's the idea. And then with this whole budget thing, they might even, give budget limitations to the engineers when they're building a spacecraft. Kerbal Space Program has a way of pricing the spacecrafts that you build, so, we wouldn't have to, the game would do that calculation for us. And then there would also be the option for the students to run simulations. What that would mean is that they would not have to pay the full price of the spacecraft. They would be pretending to be in a simulation. And that would basically mean that the pilots could practice whatever it is that they wanted to. They would. That means that the students could use the game with all of its quality of life features, reverting flights, using save points and loading them, using the game's cheat system where they can put objects into orbit just with the click of a button. All, for the purpose of practice, for giving the astronauts their practice in orbital maneuvers and landings and re-entries and liftoffs and all that kind of thing. This would be a lot cheaper than actually building the vessel and having it launched, because that's the other thing then, once they're not simulating, then they would have actual real missions. And the real missions would consume one of their produced spacecraft, so they might have to construct multiple ones. And during those flights, they would not be able to use all those features. They would not be able to save their game. They would not be able to revert their flights, and they would not be able to use cheats. Depending on how well this goes, I might consider some leniency rules, like maybe giving them a limited number of quick saves, for instance, or something like that. But the point is to get a real feeling of, yeah, let's simulate it for a bit, and all right, now here comes the main event. Now this one's for real, right? That's the idea. And so this is the concept. This is what I thought of. And depending on how well they do, if they accomplish the moon landing maybe a lot earlier than I assume, which is entirely possible. Remember, kids learn very well by themselves. Then I would have a bunch of other ideas for them. All right, okay, we did the moon landing, so maybe now, what do you guys want to do? Would you like to start, constructing space stations? Would you guys like to start constructing moon bases? Would you guys like to start setting our target for Mars? Or what else would you want to do? So that we could have additional goals that we can strive towards. But the point is that the students basically do the work themselves. They're the ones who build the spaceships, who fly them, and I'm really just there to kind of facilitate it. This is what is known as kind of like the project mode set. This is the project approach, a kind of a Dewey style view on the whole thing, where basically you kind of just give them the goal, you give them the tools, and you give them the assistance if they need it. I'm there to help them if they feel stuck, if they feel like they can't progress, if they feel like they hit a dead end. Obviously, I'm there to help them out. But for the most part, this is not like the traditional classroom model where you hold a presentation and then you're like, okay, now here is your very specific task, do this. This was not my concept. Alternatively, or additionally more like, if the students felt the need, then I would obviously maybe during the year, after the first couple sessions, I might still hold presentations in the first half of individual sessions. If they expressed interest in a particular topic, I would do some research on that and bring that into them and talk to them about it. If there was something particular they wanted to learn, they could ask me, obviously, and even if I didn't know about what they were asking, then I could find out and I could bring it in and talk about it. So I was open to things like that. However, obviously, this is a pretty ambitious project, as you're probably thinking to yourself right now. Well, this seems, some of you might be thinking, this seems a little complicated for a bunch of 8th grade students. And to that I would say, again, kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They could, especially if they work in groups in kind of a more fun, stress-free environment, then they can probably they can grasp these sort of concepts pretty well. And again, keep in mind that you are right now getting a view of the whole comprehensive overlook of the entire project, whereas the students themselves would be very focused on their own individual sections of it. It's like Henry Ford said, right? Nothing is particularly difficult if you divide it up into small tasks. A couple of problems that might, come up is, well, you know what? We'll get to that in a minute. This was my concept. This was my idea. And then what actually happened? Well, in its entirety, the project could not come to fruition this way for several reasons. Most notable of which was that, well, I was just fresh out of time. I got word that I needed to do this at the beginning of the spring semester. I found out in February. I spent the entirety of March trying to, contact the school, and they got back to me. By the time they got back to me and we actually started discussing how we could do this, it was already mid-April. And my deadline was the end of May. So basically, as I was running out of time, the school was extremely helpful. They were very enthusiastic and very flexible about the whole thing. So they offered me an alternative solution so that at the very least I could absolve my course, right? So I didn't come up with this huge ambitious idea and then just didn't have anything to show for it at the end. Basically what ended up happening was they set aside four sessions of a particular class for me to do this with 2 8th grade groups. This means eight sessions total, which was 4 sessions with 2 different groups, right? 2 times 4. And each of those sessions was 2 times 45 minutes, an hour and a half each. So this basically qualified for the amount of hours of volunteer work that I had to perform. So, I finished it there. And not to mention all the time, of course, that I spent preparing and all that. So, the hours were easily there. The time that I spent with the students, however, was way, 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 way too little for me to actually be able to do all the things that I wanted to do. But I did get to, at the very least, do something similar to what I wanted. Here's what actually ended up happening. The school offered me time out of their technical class. I don't know what this is in English, if it exists at all. It's a kind of thing that we have in Hungary, maybe other places too, where kids spend the class learning practical skills that can come in handy for them during their school year. During their own, real lives. And the problem with this class, in my eyes, is that it was divided up in between boys and girls. Boys learned how to, build and the DIY thing. Girls learned how to sew and cook. I know, it's horrible. Trust me, I hate it too. But the upside of this was that I only had to deal with half a class. Obviously they handed me to the boys, right? It was like the boys who wanted to do this. So, I had to deal with half a class. Less kids meant, an easier group to work with. That was the upside. Obviously, the downside was that I never really wanted to differentiate between genders, but at this point, I didn't really have a choice, right? I needed to get this done. So I got my time slots. I got my groups. And now all I had to do was kind of condense my idea into 4 hour-and-a-half sessions. And basically what ended up happening was I spent one session just talking, telling them about space exploration, talking about the past, about the present, and giving them an overview of what it is that I wanted to do in the brief time that we had together. Then I came up with I basically took over the role of the scientist group. I trashed the scientist group entirely, divided the kids into engineers and pilots, and then myself kind of laid out the mission plan for them. I gave them a basic 3-step mission for a moon landing. One was orbit of Earth along with, a flyby of the moon. And, if they felt ambitious, then an orbit around the moon. This was one mission. Second mission was the rendezvous and docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit of Earth. That was mission number 2. And the mission number 3 was the actual moon landing and return to Earth from the surface of the moon. It's not a lot, as you can tell. And it's a lot. In my original idea, this is something that the kids would have come up with themselves. Maybe they would have skipped the whole rendezvous docking thing. Maybe they would have done a direct descent flight, right? Who knows? But the point is that due to the very short time that I had, I ended up having to condense the whole thing into this. And not only did I have to condense the missions, I also ended up having to, in some cases, start off the missions from a later point. The moon landing mission, for instance, I started off from orbit of the moon, so they wouldn't have to take the time flying around the moon again. And a whole bunch of other things, like I had to jump in and help them build the spaceships. I had to give them a lot more pointers. Again, in the original concept, everything they would have figured out themselves. Here, I had to basically give them guidelines on how to build spaceships. I had to give them, explanations as to how they should divide up their stages. I had to basically coach the pilots myself, and I had to do a lot more direct control to facilitate a lot more direct control over this group than I originally planned to, which hurt. It hurt me on some level, but also simultaneously, I didn't really have much choice. And, the good news is that we did get through my program in the end. It was extremely tight, but we made it. Every group managed to do their moon landing. Not every group. I think one of the two groups didn't manage to finish their docking. They did the rendezvous, but they didn't manage to finish the docking before we ran out of time for that particular day. And so that's basically what happened. That is what I got out of it at the end. This is the program that I ended up being able to do. You'll notice that a lot of it was left out. The entire business management aspect was out. I gave them sort of minor challenges, like if they could do it, below a certain budget, like, plus points. Just like, if they managed to orbit the moon on their first flight, also plus points. But the idea really, I guess, at this point was if I couldn't really deliver the full interactive space program experience, the very least that I wanted to do was sort of convey a love, an appreciation, a beauty of all this, all the space flight involvement, right? I wanted to try and get them engaged in it. I wanted them to see the beauty of it as much as I did. And when it comes to that, I think I can very safely say that I succeeded. So now let me talk a little bit about kind of my finishing thoughts, my conclusions, my experiences with all this. So you've heard how the program went down. During the program, during all of these classes, I was very pleased to see that the kids were a lot more interactive than I thought they would be. They engaged with the topic very much. They were asking me questions. They were bombarding me with questions about spaceflight, and I was very prepared to have just a bunch of kids, sitting and listening to me talk. But no, they were curious. And they were asking good questions. Not only that, but they knew a lot of things ahead of time as well. So they obviously knew a little bit. It was cool that they knew a little bit more than I thought they would. And they were interested. They were super interested. They kept asking me questions. So it's obvious that I was right in the sense that, yes, this is a topic that inspires. This is definitely a topic that inspires, even at that young age. Two other things to my delight. One of the final moon landing groups actually seemed to be doing a lot better job than I expected them to. And when I questioned them on this, it turned out, well, the reason was one of the kids, got his hand on the game, and then the other kids, some of the others, went to his house, and then they played it together, and they practiced moon landing. And I was like, wow, really? You guys practiced this? Not only that, but in between classes, right, like in the breaks, they would routinely stop me just to have conversations about space stuff. Informal, not like, my classes were any formal or anything, but informal conversations about just what I think of space and why I think it's important. And to my absolute delight, and this is what I love the most about the whole thing, that whole thing I said earlier about how this was a boys-only thing due to the nature of the class that it was taking place in? Well, my dad has a friend whose daughter goes to that school. And it is through this grapevine that I got to hear, apparently, my little space course had gotten a reputation among the 8th grade students. And apparently, this is something I didn't know of, a lot of the 8th grade girls were trying to convince their teacher, their Technica teacher, to let them ditch the sewing and cooking and come sit into what they were calling astrology class, right? This isn't strictly speaking astrology, but astronomy, not astrology. It's two different things. So, yeah, apparently, even, this is the part that really makes me happy, because it proves another point that I've been making to Hungarians for a while, that engineering is not a male thing, right? The beauty of space, the beauty of achieving spaceflight and stuff like that, this is not something that is attractive to the male engineering mind only. A bunch of girls who had not even really sat in the class, who hadn't even really seen it, maybe just kind of gotten some glimpses of the boys piloting the spaceships, they were like, yeah, I want to try this out. In mass, they were trying to get in. And their teacher wouldn't let them, obviously, but just the fact that they wanted to, I would gladly have had them there. I would have been overjoyed. But even this way, I was beaming when I got that piece of information. The students, video games and education are similar in the sense that they both demand, they're both trying and struggling to retain audience attention. Video games, however, are actually succeeding in it somehow. And the engagement factor, thus, was high. They were very engaged in the activity. They found it fun, right? It was a fun learning experience. Obviously, they didn't they didn't get an in-depth knowledge of the physical workings about it, but that's not for 8th grade anyway. That's for something to happen later. At this point, I would say that for 8th grade students, what this video game was able to do, which was to get them interested in the topic, I think it succeeded with flying colors. And I think that this is a very good pointer for the direction to take in the future. I think that video games, simulation-style video games like Kerbal Space Program, and probably many others, have a very valid role, or should have a very valid role in education, particularly at younger ages, to get kids interested. And again, just to expose them to it. Many of the kids, in fact, most of the kids, will probably end up in careers that have nothing to do with spaceflight, space engineering. But if nothing else, now they've been exposed to it. And from now on, when they read an article about something that happened with some kind of spacecraft, they're going to understand it now. They're probably going to know what exactly it means when they say, this spacecraft just made an orbital reentry, for instance. They're going to understand it. They're going to understand why that's a big deal. They're going to understand why it took the recent Soyuz spacecraft the recent Dragon spacecraft from SpaceX to reach ISS in 3 days. They will have a grasp of this knowledge from now on, and that's something that they can build on. The teachers, by the way, who were in there also had very positive things to say about it. Just the students were beaming with enthusiasm. The teachers, they were a bit more critical, obviously. One of them, even they were both very positive in their assessments at the end. One of them gave me a very good piece of feedback, which was something that I was worried about too. To kind of reflect on what needs to happen if I want this to be realized in its original form as well. One of the things that one of the teachers brought up was a very valid point. Kids like to do this, and the only way I could do this in the school was with my own laptop. I don't know if the computers in the school's computer laboratory were, able to run Kerbal Space Program optimally. I never really bothered to check. I just took my own laptop, and used that one. But you can imagine, right, that if I have one laptop, that means that only one group of students, only one of the space program's sections can work in front of the computer at a time. Scientists don't need it, but this means that the pilots or the engineers, when the other group is working, they're basically sitting around and have nothing to do. Now, obviously, I can give them tasks. I can give them research tasks or something like that. But it would be a much better, for the program, if we could do these things parallel. Like if the students could, build the spacecraft while the pilots are training. That'd be awesome. So that's definitely one thing to consider. More opportunities for the kids to engage in it. The rules is another thing that I was thinking about. I don't know if this is something that needs to be rotated. I assumed, by the way, this was interesting, I assumed that the astronaut role would be the most popular. Everybody was shoving to either not be the astronaut or to be the engineer, right? They wanted to be able to build the spacecraft without having the responsibility of piloting it successfully, right? So this was an interesting revelation for me as well. But just in general, it's either very important because I don't want any student to feel cheated. I want them all to be able to at least try out one of the roles, the roles that they want to try out, right? Instead of just being stuck in one role for the whole time. It would really suck if a student came to the course to become an astronaut and spent their entire time in the course in an administrative job, right? Although that probably would be very true to life. But at the very least, if I choose not to allow rotation in between groups, then at the very least, I should, before they pick, I should give them the opportunity to try each one out first, right? So that's also a factor to consider. And then, there's a bunch of other things that could turn up. I still basically haven't been given the opportunity to try out my program as I wanted to. But the school expressed interest. They said that, given the proper amount of time for preparation, if I actually can, start this course off in September, they would be happy to have me. I could do it as an actual extracurricular school activity too, so I wouldn't be constrained by, the school year or the school classes, and I could operate freely however I want. I'm sure that various problems are going to present themselves. But that's the thing, is that this is not just a learning process for them. It's a learning process for me as well. And if I want this kind of thing to be more popular, if I want this to happen, I want to keep propagating this type of practice, then obviously this means that I'm going to have to start improving as well. And that really was the point of this entire project from my perspective, is that unlike anywhere else, unlike anything else that I have done during my school year, this was probably the one project where I personally grew the most. It forced me to move out of my comfort zone, to get over a bunch of social anxiety problems, to initiate things on myself and not rely on existing projects and other people to help me out. This was entirely a project of my own working. And I grew a lot during it. I learned a lot during it. And I honestly think that there is a future to this. I think that I can take this and I can make it something big. I can maybe take this to multiple schools. Maybe some other schools would be interested as well. Maybe I can expand the scope. Maybe I can make multiple ones. Maybe I can have multiple space programs competing against each other. Maybe we can have a space race between classes. Worked for the 60s. But yeah, I got fired up by it. They got fired up by it too. A lot of them, I think, were left wanting more. They were all very warm towards me, very kind, very humorous, and I enjoyed my time with them. And I eagerly await future opportunities to take more 8th graders to the moon and back. My name has been Lemorack. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. If you have any discussion topics regarding this, I would be happy to read them in the comment section below. Otherwise, I thank you very much once again for listening, and I'll see you next time.